Hi guys, so I come to you from my chill perch on my mum's sofa. I'm off back to London, to reality tomorrow. Not that I haven't been working in Edinburgh, but back to routine. And before I left, I thought I would squeeze in one last video, which is my end of month reading wrap up for December. So this is the final wrap up of 2019. We're already into 2020. Usually I upload my wrap ups earlier than this, but I also recognise that it's not that late and nobody cares when I upload it. So regardless of when we are here, and we're going to talk about all the books I read in December, which was actually quite a fair few. That month went on for quite some time and I feel like I did quite a lot of reading, so I really shouldn't be sitting here blethering away when I could be reviewing the books I read. For no particular reason, I think I'll actually work my way backwards from the book I finished last in December until the books I read at the beginning of December. So the book I finished at the end of December was Proper English by K.J. Charles. This is a combination of many things really. It's set in the early 1900s from what I recall, and it's particularly about one aristocratic young woman from like a well-to-do family who is, you know, reaching that point in her life where she's considered a bit of an old maid, because at this point she would have been expected to be married if she was going to get married. And she's off to a house party in the countryside in one of her friends' residences with her brother, who is also friends with this young man who is the sort of lord of this house, and a group of people that she otherwise doesn't know. And this group comes together in this household where, of course, secrets start to unravel. So it has the sort of air of a kind of Agatha Christie novel, a kind of classic early 1900s crime novel where everybody has a secret. We don't know what those secrets are, we don't know who is in each other's business, but we're kind of overhearing snippets here and there until something particularly criminal happens in the house itself, and they have to sort of piece all of the things together that they already know in order to find out who committed the crime. And I won't say more than that. But as well as being this kind of like Agatha Christie-esque crime novel, it's also a romance between our main female protagonist and another young woman visiting this house. And this other young woman is actually the fiancée of the lord in question that I mentioned earlier, although their relationship seems to be a bit of a tense one and nobody quite understands why they got engaged so quickly. And this fiancé and our main character develop a relationship. It sort of starts as a friendship, but they just immediately kind of take to one another and bring out the best in one another and see the best in one another. They both feel like the other person sees them, and that's lovely. So it is a kind of historical female-female lesbian romance in a historical sort of crime novel. You know, it's like such a mishmash of genres, but it worked so well. I love a kind of Agatha Christie cozy crime novel, so that was a tick for me. That was great fun. I love a bit of a I love a bit of a historical romance, and I love anything queer, LGBTQ+, especially if it's a relationship between two women. I love seeing all of those things in literature, and I've never read a book that really combines all of those things in the way that this book did, so that was so much fun. This book I genuinely just came across when I was searching for historical romance novels with queer characters, and I was so impressed. But gosh, I wish they were like a kind of crime fighting series of their own, because this book just, you know, like I said, combines so many elements that I love and never necessarily expected to find all together in one book. So if you like any of those things, I would highly recommend this book, because I think it's a really good balance. Therefore, if you don't necessarily normally read romance but love cozy crime, I still think you should check this out. And I think if you like a bit of historical romance but don't necessarily read cozy crime, you should still check it out, because it is, like I mentioned, a really good balance of things. So loved that. That was just like a good romp, rip-roaring fun. Like, that's exactly what it was. We then have Harp of Kings by Juliet Marillier. This one already made it into my best books of the year video, so you've heard me wax lyrical about it in there. And of course I love this. Well, not of course, because I don't necessarily love every book by a favourite author, but generally speaking, Juliet Marillier is a 5-star writer for me, and most of her books I've given 5-star, and this one is within that kind of majority there. This is actually Marillier's most recent novel. It only came out at the end of 20 19 and it's the first in a new series following 3 protagonists. So we have 3 points of view in this book. We have Levon, her brother Brock, and a fellow warrior trainee of theirs called Dao, and all 3 of these young people are training to become warriors on Swan Island, which is a place that Juliet Marillier created in her other books, but you don't need to have read her other books to understand this storyline, where, like I've already said, warriors are trained and they're being sent off on their first mission, but they're not exactly serving as warriors in this instance, they're serving as spies. So they all have to take on new identities that very much challenge their own weaknesses when it comes to what their kind of trainers have seen in them on this island, and they're also accompanied by 2 more like established warriors. Their mission is to find the Harp of Kings, which is a harp that was gifted to humans by the fair folk in this small kingdom as a sort of peace offering, and it is supposed to be played at the coronation of every new king in order to kind of bless their rule. And if it's not played at the coronation of this prince who's about to become king, everyone believes that his rule will kind of be destined to fail if he's even accepted by the people. So they've been hired to do this job, and it's about them undertaking this job. It is a historical medieval Irish fantasy novel, as well as them kind of growing as people, learning more about themselves, where they want to be, because for example, Brock doesn't necessarily have great desire to be a warrior, or at least that never comes across within the novel. He is in many ways skilled and could be one, but he seems to have gone to Swan Island for his sister. Dao also has a lot of dark stories in his past. They're affecting his relationships in the present, and he builds a friendship with Levon, which I think is going to become a romance. I feel like that's what the book was establishing there, and I cannot wait to see what is in store for these characters in future books. I really fell in love with all 3 of them, even though at the beginning, in particular Brock, I felt like his perspective didn't seem necessary to me for the first few chapters. It felt very short, it didn't feel like it was adding anything, but as the book unfolds I learned really why Brock's perspectives were so necessary to the storyline, and as his story seemed to kind of cut off from the other 2 characters and go its own way, I really loved hearing about his journey as much as I did Levon and Dao's characters. So I think if you have read any Juliet Marillier in the past, this one very much lives up to the excellency of her like classic series like Blackthorn and Grimm and the Seven Waters books, and equally I think it would make an excellent place to start. I think it's a really accessible place to start. I then read an illustrated children's book, which is Hercules, Bambbles and Heroes. This book is going to be of niche interest to people. Not only is it a children's book about Greek mythology, but it's also written in Scots. So this is a book that was published by Ichiku a few years ago, who are a children's publisher that specialise in Scots language books. They both translate books into Scots. For example, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone they've translated into Scots, but they also produce kind of new books like Hercules, Bambles and Heroes, which is a classic story. It's the story of Hercules' 12 labours that he has to go off and achieve after he murders his family during a curse that was placed on him, and this is sort of his redemption arc. But it has been written from scratch, if that makes sense, by the author. It's his telling of the stories with a lot of humour. Again, like I said, this is aimed at children and it's so humorous, and I think it both plays on the Scots language to create its humour, but it also just like has a lot of classic kind of children aimed humour. There's some kind of like potty humour in there, but it's all very clever and engages with the Scots language in a really endearing way. It is totally a book I would put in the hands of young Scottish people who are trying to both like retain their language and their understanding of Scots, as well as kind of trying to increase their knowledge of Scots. I think it can achieve both things, but equally I don't know if this is a book for people who have no experience of Scots language at all. So it's up to you whether you want to read it, but I think it's a very good example of what it is. We also have another book that made it to my best books of the year video, which was Women, Race and Class by Angela Davis. This is a non-fiction book. It is a collection of essays. Each chapter is on a different subject, but they're all very closely tied together. They've been clearly written and collated to create a whole book, rather than some essay collections which feel more sporadic and like just essays an author has written that don't necessarily tie together specifically. These ones do. This is a complete book, although I think you could you know, pick up one essay in it and still learn something. And the essays kind of follow the history of black women in America from the time of slavery up until the civil rights movement. So we learn about kind of what it was like for black women as slaves, their kind of role in the black community, in the slave community, in their families, their specific treatment. You know, they obviously experienced a lot of sexual abuse from their owners, as well as all the other horrifics that slaves went through, and it explores all of those kind of specifics of black women's experiences. It then traces both the abolitionist movement in the US and the women's liberation movement in the US, so both women fighting for women's liberation, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, and groups fighting for the freedom of slaves, and how those organisations treated black women, so where they kind of did black women justice and included black women in their movements but also left them out, so say sexism within the abolitionist movement and racism within the women's liberation movement. And then kind of the way black women established their own groups and cultures and activism in the US over the years then post-slavery and into the civil rights movement, like I mentioned. And it's an incredible book. It manages to contain so much information on a vast array of topics, but it never feels like too dense or inaccessible, and it still manages to be quite short. You know, it's only over 200 pages. I think most people would be able to read and understand most of it. I think, like I said, it's a very accessible text. It did originally come out in the 1980s, but it still has a great deal of relevancy today because it is exploring a historical subject as well as a subject that was contemporary to Angela Davis, but exploring how the past affected the present, so you can still see how the past affects the present today when you read it. And I think, just as my inclusion of it in my favourite books of the year implies, I think this is an amazing book that you should really check out. I think it's well worth a read. I think it's a really great introduction to many topics, but also like a building block if you are familiar with some of the topics in there, because like I said, it covers so much and ties all of those themes together. And I always have found Angela Davis's books to be incredibly accessible but informative, and really just well done, as this book was. We then have a reread, and that is Radiance by Grace Draven. I first read this book around a similar time in 2018, late 2018, and have never been able to forget about it. It is definitely one of my favourite fantasy romance. It's probably my favourite fantasy romance. Is it my favourite? It's one of my favourite fantasy romance books of all time. I could say it's a favourite in certain genres, but it's a book I absolutely adored and have, yeah, like I mentioned, thought about a lot since I read it, and I finally just decided I needed to reread it. I wasn't necessarily in the best headspace. A lot of stuff went on kind of globally, nationally, personally in December, so I wanted to return to a book I knew I loved and characters I knew I loved, and this book did not disappoint on a second read. It was, you know, just as 5-star a book as it was the first time, the second time around. We follow Ildiko and Brishan, who are a nobleman and a noblewoman from their respective kingdoms that have been set up in an arranged marriage. Ildiko is a human and Brishan is a Kai, which is a race of magical beings that Grace Draven has created for her fiction, and they, you know, don't often marry. There's not a lot of like attraction between their two races. They find each other kind of repugnant. Their cultures vary, although they manage to find similarities, but you know, there's that kind of initial boundary to their marriage. However, they manage to strike up this friendship from the beginning of their marriage. They're both incredibly respectful to one another, and there's no pressure for them to have a romantic relationship. They've done their duty in marrying one another, as their kind of places in society requires them to, in order to establish an alliance between their two kingdoms. But they're not expected to provide an heir. Brishan is a prince, but he is not heir to the throne, and therefore they're able to just kind of coexist with one another in what turns out to be a really incredible bond that does develop into a romantic one, but from this really wonderful, respectful place. And it is one of the best romance novels I have ever read. Like, of the non-fantasy or fantasy genres within romance, this is one of the best and most like genuinely good role models for a relationship I've ever read in a book, which I don't actually feel like I read a lot of. Like, I feel like this is a relationship that I think epitomizes so many of the things that we should strive for in our romantic relationships, even if it is set in a fantasy world, and it is so nice to read about. Both characters are so interesting, have so many different sides to them. You get to know them at the same time that they're getting to know one another, and I think the pacing of that relationship builds perfectly from the reader's perspective because it all just feels so sincere, and I just love this book. There is a little bit of a political fantastical backdrop plotline, but it's pretty much secondary to the relationship between these two people, and I love this book. So I loved rereading it. It did not disappoint me, and I would encourage you to pick it up 100%. Then all of the rest of the books I have to mention were queer, which is wonderful, and all but one of them I read for the Queer Lit Readathon. So I participated in the Queer Lit Readathon at the beginning of this month. I filmed a vlog for that readathon where I talked about the books I was reading as I read them, so I will link that down below if you want to kind of see how my thoughts developed as I was reading each book and perhaps get a little bit more in-depth reviews for each one, but I will briefly mention them all here. However, first of all, I'll mention the queer book I read that was not for the Queer Lit Readathon, which unfortunately was my most disappointing read of the month, and that is The Dark Wife by Sarah Dimer. I wanted to love this book so much, but it kind of fell down for me in two main aspects. There were endearing qualities to it, and it's not to say I wouldn't necessarily read more by this author in the future. This is an earlier novel by her that came out quite a few years ago, and the issues I found with this book may not necessarily apply to future books, but I'll explain to you why it didn't work for me. It is a retelling of Greek mythology. It's a retelling of the Hades and Persephone myth. So if you're not familiar, the Hades and Persephone myth is about the god Hades, who's god of the underworld, and he abducts Persephone, who's goddess of spring, and the daughter Demeter, who's goddess of the harvest, also daughter of Zeus, the king of the gods, and brother to Hades. They're all related. You just kind of need to move on from that in Greek mythology. But Hades abducts Persephone and takes her to the underworld to become his wife. Persephone has no say in the matter. And I think personally I feel like it's really important to establish that this is not a consensual story in Greek mythology. In no version of the Hades and Persephone myth, from antiquity, so when this is a myth about people's gods, is it consensual. There are, however, lots of modern retellings where it is consensual, and this is one of them. So this is a version of the myth where Hades and Persephone choose to be with one another. There's no abductions. Persephone goes to the underworld of her own accord. And that is something I see a lot in retellings, and I don't necessarily have like a blanket objection to that. I think myths are there to be retold, they're there to be interpreted by different societies and different people, and to be reclaimed, and that's completely okay. So if you can do a convincing job to me of retelling that story in a consensual way, for whatever reason you choose to do that, that's all grand and etc, etc. But I do see people online talking about how it's a myth with more ambiguity than there is, because I've seen people mention that there are both non-consensual and consensual versions in antiquity. But as an ancient historian and as somebody who has a lot of expertise in Greek mythology and has asked other people working in this area, there is not an ancient version where it's consensual. And what I found difficult about this story, given its consensual nature, was not the very fact that it was changed. Like I mentioned, this is like all up for grabs when you want to retell a story, is that the book is trying to make a comment on the kind of sexual abuse that is prevalent within Greek mythology. Like, the book is very specifically trying to discuss the way in which Zeus is a sexual abuser throughout mythology. I mean, Zeus sexually assaults so many women and men in Greek mythology, like, all the time. And this book is making a comment on that and trying to kind of, like, explore that in Zeus's character and kind of the horrors of that. And I completely respect that endeavour. But I find it difficult to read a book that is trying to explore the nature of sexual abuse in Greek mythology by turning a myth of non-consent into consent. I personally felt like that undermined some of the points she was trying to make, because it seemed like an arbitrary decision to be like, Zeus is this terrible rapist, but I'm turning Hades into this character that isn't one. And that's where I felt a little bit uncomfortable, or at least just not, or at least I couldn't understand that decision. Like, I just felt like it was less convincing as a narrative. I mentioned that this is a queer story though, and in this book Hades is a woman, so it does very much flip a lot of the myth. It changes it so Hades is a woman, this is a consensual relationship between two women, So in lots of ways it very much changes the myth, and I think when you change a myth a lot you have more leeway to, you know, change motivations and situations. You're only really working within a loose framework in that instance, but then in other ways it felt like it was trying to comment on the original myths and adhere to the original myths. So the balance for me wasn't right. I felt like it was sitting in an uncomfortable middle place rather than going in one of two more decisive directions, if that makes sense. And then I also may just not have felt that way if I just found the relationship between Hades and Persephone more convincing. Like, I just felt like I didn't actually spend a lot of time with Hades and Persephone, and their relationship felt quite out of thin air to me. Like, it didn't really feel that convincing as a reader, and I think the narrative should have spent more time on the characters together than separately building that relationship. So from a narrative reader perspective, rather than someone that knows a lot about Greek mythology, I didn't really find that believable either. However, I did think some of the comments on Greek mythology were interesting. Some of the portrayals of gods and goddesses were interesting, and I always find that I can find something to enjoy about a Greek myth retelling because it always gets me thinking, and that's really wonderful, and I really enjoy that. So it wasn't like a 1-star read, but it wasn't necessarily a book that I particularly enjoyed. But then we move on to the books I read specifically for the Queer Lit Readathon. First up was Dead India Volume 1. This is a big, chunky, graphic novel, the first in a series, following a young trans man and his friends, and he gets a job in a haunted theme park, and it's such a fun concept, and I talked a lot about it in the wrap-up as I was reading it. It was wonderful both to see the diversity of representation in this book, particularly when it came to the LGBTQ plus spectrum, both gender identity and sexualities, but it was also just like a really fun adventure. Like, what a fun concept. This theme park has within it a portal to the other realms, including like where demons and etc. live, and angels, although the book explores kind of what is really different between those two creatures. And then obviously this magic and these demonic presences leak into the theme park, and our characters get embroiled in slightly paranormal adventures, which I loved. My only kind of reason for kind of knocking off a star was the ending felt very dark in a way that the book itself had not been. Like, the stakes had always felt quite low throughout the book. It felt quite fun and enjoyable whilst exploring contemporary issues of the treatment of LGBTQ people, but then something like really dramatic and happened with the paranormal aspects at the end that I found kind of upsetting, because I had just been enjoying this fun novel with kind of queer commentary within it, and then it just felt like it came out of nowhere and just personally felt too dark from what I'd been getting from it overall. However, I still think it's worth the journey, even if the ending jarred me. I think that the book itself was so much fun, and I think I will definitely be borrowing volume 2 from the library, which I did from volume 1. I'm sure I still gave it 4 stars. Like, it was still so much fun and combined a lot of fun elements. We then have Orpheus Girl, which I talked a lot about again in that video. This is not exactly a retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. It's a story in its own right that draws on themes and relates the narrator's identity to characters from within Orpheus and Eurydice, and I think I explained that better in that video when I had a little bit more time to do so, but I really admired what the author was doing here. Now, this is a dark novel with quite high stakes that is quite difficult to read. It's a YA story about 2 young girls living in a conservative town in the American South who are sent to a conversion camp or conversion facility to be turned straight because their families and community cannot accept their identity as young queer gay women who have feelings for other women, specifically one another. And our narrator sees this as an opportunity to save the girl she's in love with, in the way that Orpheus travels down to the underworld to save his wife Eurydice in the original myth. But she's very much throughout the story using myth to kind of explore her own identity, to kind of separate herself from the horrific things that are happening to her in the conversion facility. Like, really hard to read about, but something that we need to know about. So maybe not everybody would be able to read this book for personal reasons, but it's certainly something that needs to be in literature and we need to be talking about and we need to be aware of, and I think it was a really cleverly done through that use of myth. And I would definitely read whatever the author Bryony Rebel Henry brings out in the future. That was her first novel, and I thought it was just like a very important story, and from my perspective I really enjoyed the way it used Greek myth to tell that story and explore identity. We then have a sequel, which is Turning the Storm. This is book 2 in a Geology, so it was the final book in the series, by Naomi Kritzer, and this is a fantasy faux historical, like political intrigue novel. It has sort of like a faux Italian setting, like it's not Italy, it's set in another fantastical world, but it has a lot of sort of allusions to Italian culture and kind of like Italian names, etc. And it is so much fun. I loved book 2 in this series. It started off a little bit slow, but by sort of the midway point and the second half, I could not put it down, and it just felt like the perfect ending to this character's story. It's about Elena, who is a student at a musical conservatory. She plays the violin in a world with a very strict religious system which punishes those that practice the non-mainstream religion or an older religion that's kind of been overthrown, for example. And the religious system is very tied up in the state and the empire and the sort of political system, and it's such an interesting exploration of like a really detailed political fantasy world with this complex religious system where there's never a complete kind of consensus on what is the good or bad religion, and sort of showing the flaws in the ways that both religions are used by people in power, but also the story of one young girl's coming of age and understanding of her own sexuality. So throughout the book, Elena is realising that she has feelings for other women in a world that is not necessarily that accepting of her sexuality. But it's not necessarily like romance. There is an element of that. There is another young woman that Elena has feelings for and comes in and out of the story, but it feels like a story of one woman's journey amidst a really like detailed backdrop political system. And Elena, I should mention, in the first book gets heavily involved in the rebellion because whatever the current state is doing is leading to a lot of suffering for their people, and Elena gets, you know, embroiled in that and becomes quite an important player in what will happen and how kind of political events will unfold. So she has both this like bigger part to play in the world as a whole, but also like a personal journey that she's going through, like I mentioned. And I thought it was such a good balance of those two things. Elena felt like such a real character to me that had really been fully, you know, rendered and brought to life throughout both books, and I loved finding out what was next in the cards for her in book 2. Like, I think with these books, they're quite slow paced, but they never feel like they are stagnating. Something new is always around the corner, so it always keeps you guessing and wondering what's going to happen next. The stakes feel real, the characters feel real, and I absolutely adore this Geology, and I'd love to see more people reading and talking about it. Then lastly, we actually have a book that I read for the Queer Lit Readathon, which turned out to not really have any queer elements, although people have mentioned they kind of become more prevalent as the series goes on, and that is The Woods, which is the first in a comic book like bind up series, and it's a kind of horror science fiction series. Basically, an entire school is transported to another world. We're not quite clear. Is it another planet? Is it like the future? Is it a parallel universe? Whatever it is though, it's incredibly dangerous. There are dangerous monsters around every corner, and then there is obviously the danger of people kind of turning on one another between the teachers and the students, and people wandering off, other people trying to kind of survive in this school, and it's a big mess basically. And I really enjoy horror and horror graphic novels, although I don't feel like I was massively hooked by the first volume. Like, nothing really got me super like involved and like I needed to know more. It was interesting, but I don't think I would go out of my way to pick up the second volume. Like, it just sort of was fine, but I haven't really thought about it since, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm invested enough to continue on, and that's all I really have to say about it. Those are all the books I read though. I feel like this is quite a long wrap up, but hopefully you've enjoyed hearing my thoughts on these books. There's been a bit of a mixture in feelings towards them all, but some really excellent books as well, and some really excellent reads that I hope you will check out. I would love to chat with you about any of the things I've read in this video in the comments down below, so do leave your comments, and until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!